Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and we're exploring the wonderful region of the Cotswolds in southwest England. We've decided to revisit the centre of the region and find some hidden gems, places that are not quite so famous, but still just as beautiful. And today you find me and Ross in a tiny village called Turkdean. This place is a kind of classic Cotswold gem. Very unspoiled indeed, quiet as a mouse, and a lovely little church. We're going to show you around. Come with us. I approached this tiny peaceful village from the north. On the way from Bourton on the Water down the A436, the lane to Turkdean is on your left and leads you through some wonderfully unspoiled countryside. Not far down this little lane, I came across an unusual sight. Acres and acres of land left fallow, wild flowers all over the place, very large tracts of land, looking for all the world like so much of this land might have looked several hundred years ago. I find it interesting the degree to which at first glance my spirits were lifted by this sight. We've come as a species to feel extremely guilty that our presence and influence has been so detrimental to our surroundings that we welcome any sign of stepping backwards. Hence my original reaction. However, I have a niggling concern. Amongst the myriad of beautiful wildflower colours was a very considerable spattering of yellow, which, unless I am hopelessly mistaken, was a plant called ragwort. When I was a kid in the 1950s and 60s, growing up in the countryside, ragwort was seen as a seriously problematic plant. If eaten by horses or cattle, it is extremely poisonous. Now, these animals aren't stupid enough to eat the easily identifiable live plant with its bright yellow flowers, but if it is cut or falls over and dies, it becomes far less easy to see without diminishing its poison. We, as children, therefore, were charged with what we were told was a great responsibility of pulling any ragwort plant from the ground whenever we saw it and taking it to be burned on the bonfire, something all country places had in those days, almost permanently hot. Now, I have absolutely no idea of the landowner's plans for this fallow land. Indeed, I'm highly conscious that it's none of my business. But does he intend to cut it, in which case he will be laying poisonous traps all over it? Or does he intend to leave it all for nature, firstly to do the same, and then to revert first to scrub and eventually to woodland? Or maybe I am simply so old-fashioned that everything I'm saying is nonsense, in which case I'm sure you will let me know. Arriving in Turkdean, you're immediately aware of the peace and tranquility of the place. It's tiny, perfectly formed, and clearly extremely welcoming. We quickly got into conversation with a church warden who told us much about the village and, naturally, about the church. British History Online tells us that the principal water spring on Chalk Hill on the northeast side of the Turkdean Valley, one of many in the valley issuing from the band of Fuller's Earth above the village, feeds a stone-lined culvert, probably associated with a Roman settlement that lasted on the hillside until at least the 4th century. This goes a long way to explain the way the village is laid out. I do love it when it becomes so clear that people have appreciated the benefits of living in a particular place for so many centuries. The Church of All Saints is originally Norman and would have been just a nave and chancel. Later a tower was added to the western end of the nave. There are Norman remnants in this church. Half of a Norman doorway arch with chevron decorations appears in the outside north wall, and in the south wall of the chancel there has been reset the upper half of a tiny Norman doorway. The chancel arch is in the Norman style, but probably 19th century. As with almost all the churches we come across, alterations have been made at several times over the centuries. The font is rumoured to be a replica of an earlier damaged perpendicular font, and there is a nice solid stone pulpit. The rood screen, which until quite recently was in its intended position under the chancel arch, has now been moved to the south wall, where you can see its vivid coloured decoration. There is a large but very faint wall painting, probably 14th century, of a figure you might have expected to be St. Christopher, traditionally depicted on church walls, but this one appears not to have the Christ child on his shoulders. There's also some good stained glass. The east window is probably from around 1850, and the lovely south aisle window is even more recent. It dates from 1937. I have to admit, however, that the most exciting thing for me about this church is one of its congregation members, and a regular musical contributor to its choir, its services, and its fundraising events. Somewhere close by lives a man I first saw and was introduced to in London's Marquee Club in the 1960s. He was and remains one of the most talented and natural musicians I've ever come across. He was the core of a band called the Spencer Davis Group, and his name is Steve Winwood. I'm not ashamed to say I get a frisson of starstruckness just writing his name. I'll clearly have to start going to church in Turkdean. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Turkdean. It's a tiny place. Tread lightly when you come here because it is undisturbed. It could have something to do with the contrast between where we were earlier this morning, because it doesn't appear so, but we were actually filming this morning in Bourton on the water, which is very touristy indeed. Turkdean is deserted, peaceful and lovely. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the normal platforms, and you'll find us very soon somewhere else in the Cotswolds.